Hey everyone, today we're doing a video about the final writer for Avengers Volume 3, a series that ran in the early 2000s and helped usher the team into the modern age. For those that don't know, here at Comic Island, I've been reviewing every main series Avengers comic that's ever been published. So be sure to subscribe to our channel and check out this playlist for the rest of grading the Avengers. This is another round where I knew very little about the books going in, but I certainly know enough about the writer. Chuck Austen is best and perhaps unfairly known for being the guy who had to write the X-Men after Chris Claremont, an unfortunate position that I feel has kind of earned Austen a reputation he doesn't necessarily deserve. To be fair, people have a lot of beef with this guy because of his almost abusive relationship with fans who are giving him crap for his X-Men comics in the early days of the internet. Personally, however, I feel as though Austen's particular brand of toxic behavior is a little more nuanced than my more hostile and frustrated feelings I have voiced towards people like John Byrne or Jeff Johns in this series. As far as I can tell, to me, most of Austen's behavior is him being awful to people who are already being pretty awful to him. Comic book fans can be toxic too, and they sure seem to have been towards Austen, though I admit I wasn't really involved with the comic book community around this time period, so this is just sort of what I've gleaned over the years. And I had all of this in mind when I was looking at his Avengers comics. Austen didn't last very long with the Avengers before Volume 3 was cancelled and Brian Michael Bendis essentially took over with Avengers Disassembled. But I came into what limited comics Austen did write for the series with a very open mind and heart, knowing what I know. And overall, I was more impressed than disappointed. Once again, I do feel like I am pushing against popular opinion, which seems to be slanted towards this being one of the lesser Avengers runs, but I'm not going to pretend there aren't some rather serious flaws going on with these Avengers books either. These Avengers, oddly enough, remind me a lot of The Ultimates, a reboot of the Avengers published kind of around this time that reimagined the Avengers. Though, as far as I can tell, produced independently of one another, both the Ultimates and Austen's particular take on the Avengers crank up the drama to the highest possible levels and almost seem like they're parodying each other because of it. Both rely on these screaming matches that read as though it's the Avengers' first attempt at adult drama, and the comic book world was utterly unprepared for it. The arguments in Austen's run feels like a toddler's idea of maturity, written by somebody who has seen adult people argue with each other, but never actually had an adult argument themselves. That being said, some of the drama is done really well. The civilian dying itself, a woman who is basically just a random mom caught up in the middle of the fight, is uniquely striking in Avengers history. Very rarely is action in an Avengers story brought down to this scale and given this level of emotional depth. Then the death itself sort of gets undermined by this Captain Britain nonsense, to the extent even this civilian gets a comic book death. That sort of contradiction with both good and bad stuff is kind of inherent to Chuck Austen's run. I wouldn't call it great, but it has some good moments. I wouldn't call it awful either, but it also has some very stupid lines of dialogue, and all the cool stuff I like about Austen's time with the Avengers feels like it starts early and fades fast over the 7 issues he writes, getting pretty boring by the time he wraps things up. So Chuck Austen's Avengers is a story of extremes. At times, it is doing stuff that no other Avengers book has really done before or since, but it's also just so awkward and clumsy. That imbalance kind of pulls me in both directions when evaluating this book. In spite of me having a sort of impressed opinion overall, it's not that great either. It's evident in the team itself. While I feel like Hawkeye's writing leaves a lot to be desired, this is the best Wasp has been in an Avengers comic since she led the team in the 1980s. Not only does Janet get to shine with new giant powers that are used in a bunch of creative and fun ways, but she also gets the most wonderful and cathartic chance to chew the ever-loving crap out of Hank Pym. I talked a lot about how Roger Stern did quite a bit to repair the damage done by the Jim Shooter era to Pym and Janet Van Dyne's characters. But it feels like he could only go so far. It's in Austen's run that we're finally able to give these characters some closure here, with Janet finally able to both confront and hold accountable her abuser, laying out everything that had been pulled in the Jim Shooter run and other troubling moments, including stuff from the Jeff Johns era I kind of just brushed past when reviewing that particular run last round. I give Austen a lot of credit for this, because this is where Austen seems to struggle the most. It seems like he wants to write these more mature comics, but his instincts seem to lean towards somebody who also wants to have more fun. I kind of get the impression he wanted to be sillier, more than what the culture of the time allowed for. These comics were published in the early 2000s, at a time when it was cooler to be rude, arrogant, a twat like Hawkeye, and when more lighthearted content was generally out of favor. Like the Geoff Johns era, I think the Avengers have a very limited place in that role, and require hefty talent in order to go dark. Like Geoff Johns, Austen didn't quite seem up to the task, but I feel as we start to really examine this era, it's going to look a lot better than Geoff Johns overall, and his run of Avengers books have solid moments, more so than the Johns era because of it. So while both suffer a bit from changing cultural norms, kind of going against what makes the Avengers best, Austen's comics hold up much better, and the final grade will reflect that. Because it's here where we get the full modern force of computers really benefiting what artists are capable of these days when producing Avengers art. Anyone who has been watching these videos knows I love myself some classic Avengers works, but by the time Austen comes along, Olivier Coipel suddenly starts thriving as an artist, compared to his days with Geoff Johns, giving us these dynamic and exciting action pieces that really go above and beyond anything we've seen before in this series. It's uncanny how much better this artist looks and feels with a writer like Chuck Austen compared to what had come before, and it makes me feel like Olivier's art largely was wasted for his Avengers books outside of the ones he got to pencil for Austen. Overall, it's not so much that I feel that Coipel and his inker, Andy Lanning, got more talent from their time with Geoff Johns, but rather Austen's writing was better at facilitating their talents as artists. Similarly, Scott Kolins takes over for Austen's final 3 issues along with Chris Sotomayor, and I think they do a really good job too, much better than what the same creative team did with Geoff Johns. I know I'm ragging on the Johns era quite a bit here, but it's because we have the same art teams going in with a different writer, all working right around the same time period, so it's a very relevant comparison. Like I said last round, it's difficult to identify what changes between eras of Avengers. It could be the writing or the editing, but I think we know for sure it's not the art. Because the art's great overall, and definitely buoys up my final opinion of these 7 books on the whole. Speaking of which, excellent art, crisp action, solid moments of character work, all paired with silly dialogue, awful bits of character moments for every good one Austen does, and a somewhat boring second half, make this particular run of the books kind of all over the place. As a result, I wound up giving it a grade right in the middle. While it is far from average, everything that makes it good is kind of balanced out from everything that makes it terrible, and that wound up putting it right in the middle of this grading scheme. It's interesting overall, and I do think a lot of Avengers fans would get something out of reading it, but it isn't quite good enough for me to justify a full-throated recommendation. I just can't quite put my heart into that, and if you're looking for cool Avengers books, there's a good chunk out there I'd suggest you look at first, pretty much everything with a B- grade or higher, before you come looking here. Still, for somebody with a reputation in comics like Chuck Austen, you could do an awful lot worse than a C+. Next up, Volume 3 was cancelled and Volume 1 was rebooted for a little story called Avengers Disassembled. We'll talk about that and what immediately followed next on Grading the Avengers.